Something was wrong the moment the reel began to turn. The air in the archive felt heavier, as if the room itself held its breath while the flicker of the first frame painted the walls in pale, shaking light. The sound of the projector should have been steady, but tonight it carried a strange tremor, like a warning whispered through steel gears. The footage appeared ordinary at first. An empty street, a fog that moved with the calm rhythm of early morning, but nothing about that calm felt honest. There was a stillness inside it that pressed against the skin. Then, just as the frame brightened, a faint shape appeared at the edge of the screen. Too sharp for the distance, too focused for the technology of its time. No one in the room spoke. They leaned closer instead. And the more the figure clarified, the more impossible it became. Who, or what, stood there before the camera had even been invented? And why did it turn toward us, as though it expected our arrival? The room fell silent long after the first clip ended. Not one expert dared to step forward and name what they saw, yet their hesitation spoke louder than any conclusion. The reel wasn't simply old. It behaved as though it carried its own will. Light warped where it should have faded. Shadows moved without cause. And the street shown in those frames felt alive in a way no photograph ever should. Margaret replayed the sequence again, hoping logic would return on the second viewing, but instead the strange figure appeared a moment earlier than before. She froze, unable to explain the shift, and the others exchanged dark glances. If footage changed between viewings, then the reel wasn't documenting the past. It was reacting to the present. Margaret searched the archive logs for any mention of the reel, but every entry told a different story. Some claimed it was a test film, others insisted it was mislabeled scrap, and a few records were written in hands so unsteady they barely seemed human. She noticed one note scribbled in the margin. Never screen after sundown. The ink was smeared as if by trembling fingers. She scanned the shelves again, feeling watched despite the stillness. When she placed the canister back on the desk, it emitted a hollow, metallic tap, as though something inside shifted. She hesitated. Metal reels don't move on their own. And yet the sound echoed through the archive like a warning. The first damaged frame revealed what the clean footage tried to hide. The tear ran diagonally across the image, splitting light in a way that seemed intentional. Margaret leaned closer, tracing the path of the rip, and realized it avoided the impossible figure entirely, passing through buildings, lampposts, and fog, but never touching the silhouette. Someone had damaged the film, but not to destroy it. Instead, the tears seemed to emphasize the figure, marking it as the frame's center. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. Whoever handled this reel long ago wanted to warn someone, but the message arrived too late. As midnight approached, the projector slowed with an uneasy groan, its mechanical heartbeat faltering despite perfect maintenance. The final seconds of the reel stuttered, light dimming into a dull red glow. Then the footage showed something new. A brief flicker of Elias Wren's face, looking directly into the lens, mouth parted as though mid-warning. His expression twisted into fear before the film snapped violently from the reel. The room plunged into darkness, leaving the echo of the snap ringing like a gunshot. No one breathed. They all felt the same unspoken question. Why had Elias looked into a camera that should not have been running at the moment of his death? The next morning, Margaret traced the reel's origin to a long-abandoned production house on the eastern edge of London. Most of the building had collapsed decades earlier, but its records hinted that Elias Wren once kept a private workshop hidden behind false shelving. The surviving blueprints showed a narrow corridor sealed from view, a place meant only for him. That secrecy alone unsettled Margaret. Why would a cinematographer need a room no one else could enter? As she studied the plans, she noticed faint pencil markings, notations made in frantic strokes, almost like warnings. The words repeated again and again. Do not follow the movement. She felt the air tighten around her as she realized the phrase wasn't about actors or scenes. It sounded like a plea made by someone who feared what the camera might reveal. Hidden inside a rusted file box, Margaret found the letters Elias wrote during his final months. His handwriting began calm and careful, but the later pages shook with panic, words slanting as though written in haste. He spoke of frames arriving before the moment occurs, and shadows rehearsing without their owners. The most chilling passage described a figure lingering at the edge of every shot he prepared, even before he loaded the film. He insisted the presence wasn't a trick of light, but something responding to him, watching him, learning him. Margaret felt a cold grip around her spine as she turned the final page, where Elias had scrawled a single line. "I no longer believe the camera is mine to control." The deeper she dug, the more troubling the records grew. Elias's production team, once a tight group of innovators, had dissolved abruptly. Their contracts ended on the same day, all signed with identical handwriting despite belonging to different workers. Margaret recognized the unnatural symmetry immediately. People don't write exactly the same, not with such precise repetition. Worse, each resignation letter referenced a final meeting, one not listed in any studio schedule. Rumors from surviving relatives described strange movements during filming, sudden drafts indoors, and missing equipment found in places no one recalled entering. Whatever drove the team apart did so with silent force, pushing them away from Elias as though the danger centered on him alone. Margaret visited the old studio location, now only a hollow shell cradled by scaffolding. The air inside tasted of dust and forgotten years. Cracked walls revealed glimpses of paint layers from decades gone, and the faint outlines of camera mounts scarred the floor. She imagined Elias working here, chasing something beyond ordinary vision. But the space didn't feel abandoned. It felt interrupted. Papers lay scattered in patterns too precise for decay, almost arranged. A single beam of winter light cut through the broken roof and landed on a metal plate bolted to the floor. Margaret knelt to read the inscription. The final words stung her with their clarity. "Observation room, unauthorized entry prohibited." She knew instantly this was the chamber Elias intended no one to find. Inside the collapsed studio yard, Margaret met the last surviving witness from Elias's team, a former stagehand who fled the production after a single night of film. His voice trembled as he described a moment when the camera pointed at an empty corridor, yet the developed film revealed a figure watching them from only inches away. No one had been there. Everyone present remembered the corridor as silent and still. The witness claimed Elias begged them not to look at the final frame, saying some movements were meant to stay unseen. When the witness finally did glance, he saw himself standing in the image, but facing the camera with a smile he knew he never made. That was the night he ran and never returned. The first recorded body tied to Elias's work surfaced in an old police ledger stored deep within city archives. Margaret turned the brittle pages carefully, her fingers tracing the inked outline of a victim found decades before the reel emerged. The report described a man collapsed beside a loading bay, eyes fixed open as though startled by someone standing over him. What unsettled Margaret most wasn't his expression. It was the position of his hands. They were raised in front of his face, palms outward, as if shielding himself from a bright light. Yet the ledger noted no lanterns, no flames, no reason for such a reaction. The investigator's notes ended abruptly, leaving behind only a sketch of a symbol carved into the wooden planks nearby. Margaret recognized the shape immediately. It was the same sigil that flashed for a single frame in Elias's footage. The coroner's notes added new layers of unease. His handwriting shifted from steady precision to jagged scrawl as he tried to describe the unnatural bruising across the victim's neck. Bruising shaped, not like hands, but an arc, as though curved metal had pressed against the skin. Margaret reread the passage multiple times, searching for any mention of tools or equipment that might explain the mark. None appeared. Instead, the coroner wrote something stranger. The wound is shaped like motion itself. Margaret imagined the blur of a camera shutter, slicing across a frame, dividing light into impossible shards. The idea chilled her. Could movement leave a mark, Could something captured by a lens escape into the world that recorded it? The coroner clearly feared the same question, for his final line shook with dread. This death belongs to no living culprit. Further evidence revealed the strangest detail of all: the position of the camera. According to the crime scene diagram, the device that captured the final image of the victim had been placed at an angle no tripod could support, balanced on a beam 4 meters above the ground. No ladders were present, no rigging, no signs of assistance, and yet the photograph existed, perfectly steady, framed with unnatural precision, and entirely impossible to achieve by human hands. Margaret imagined someone climbing the walls, or perhaps floating in the darkness, aligning the camera with inhuman patience. But that didn't fit the facts either. Instead, it felt like the camera had moved on its own, guided by an unseen force that understood exactly where to look. The thought left her breathless. Inside a sealed evidence drawer, Margaret discovered a rusted canister labeled with Elias's initials. Inside lay fragments of film, thin, brittle strips cut unevenly with trembling hands. She held one piece toward the light and saw the faint outline of a figure, blurred but certainly human. The grain shimmered strangely, as if resisting the lamp's glow. Notes accompanying the fragments mentioned tampering. Emulsion scraped away in narrow streaks, chemical stains that suggested deliberate sabotage. Someone had tried to destroy these frames, but only after copying them. Margaret realized the saboteur didn't want the imagery erased, only contained. Whatever appeared on these fragments had frightened someone enough to hide the truth, while making sure it could never fully disappear. Margaret's final discovery of the night was the studio's forbidden file, a document labeled simply "Experiment." Inside, Elias described a test conducted with custom lenses designed to stretch exposure beyond normal limits. He believed he could reveal what passed between frames, movements too quick for human sight, but his notes shifted from excitement to terror as he described an unexpected result. A second outline overlapping his own reflection in the lens, moving ahead of him by fractions of a second. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a trick. Elias claimed it was another version of himself, watching, anticipating, waiting. Margaret closed the file slowly, her pulse pounding. If Elias had seen his own double before the moment occurred, then the reel wasn't capturing time. It was bending it. Margaret played the restored reel again, this time slowing it frame by frame. At first, the footage showed nothing unusual, fog drifting through the alley, light trembling along the cobblestones. But as she advanced further, she noticed a figure appearing in more than one frame at once, occupying separate positions despite each exposure lasting only a fraction of a second. It stood near the lamppost, then by the wall, then at the far corner, all without leaving a trace of motion between points. The impossible duplication tightened Margaret's breath. This wasn't a trick of early filmmaking. It was something else entirely. Something that moved without passing through space. She felt a crushing stillness wrap around her. If the figure could appear in multiple places at once, then it wasn't merely being filmed. It was choosing to exist where the camera looked. Margaret paused on a frame where the figure cast a shadow that stretched against the wall in the wrong direction. The lamplight fell to the left, yet the shadow stretched to the left as well, curling like a dark limb reaching where no light should allow. Shadows obey rules. They cannot choose their path. Yet here, the darkness moved as though alive, bending around corners and following shapes not present in the frame. Margaret leaned closer, her pulse drumming in her ears. The shadow wasn't mirroring the figure. It was anticipating it. The shape pointed toward a doorway seconds before the figure turned. The more she studied the frames, the more the shadow resembled a guide leading something unseen through the alley. A chill moved through her. What kind of presence needs a shadow to show it the way? She advanced to another frame where the lamplight twisted in a way she had never seen. Instead of radiating outward, the glow bent sharply toward the figure, as if gravity itself had shifted. The light thickened, pooling around the silhouette, like liquid gold trying to cling to it. Margaret felt her breath catch. Light doesn't bend on its own. Light doesn't behave like weight. Yet here it moved with unmistakable intention, as if reaching for the presence like a vine seeking sunlight. The effect rippled across the frame, warping the brick walls and stretching the fog into long, trembling strands. Margaret realized the camera hadn't simply captured the scene. It had recorded the moment reality distorted around the figure. And whatever caused that distortion was still studying the lens. Searching deeper, Margaret found a note filed with the footage, a sheet torn from Elias's journal. On it was a looping signature, written with nervous strokes. She compared it to old studio documents and felt her stomach drop. The handwriting matched that of a worker who died 30 years after Elias. Identical curves, identical pressure, identical flourishes. Someone long dead had written in Elias' hand, or Elias had written long after his own death. The ink itself looked faded, yet fresh enough to suggest it had been added well after the reel was sealed. Margaret turned the page under the lamp's glow, watching the name shimmer faintly. Time shouldn't overlap like this. Signatures shouldn't bleed across decades. Yet here they were. Handwriting belonging to two separate lifetimes, merged into one impossible truth. In the final frames of her analysis, Margaret noticed a disturbing rhythm. The figure's stillness wasn't truly still. Its chest rose and fell in subtle pulses, slow and deliberate, as though it breathed, but not in time with any natural pattern. The movement stuttered, stopped, then resumed in unnervingly precise intervals, like a metronome set by an unfamiliar hand. She realized the footage captured a form of breathing disconnected from life itself, a mechanical imitation of something alive. With each rise of the chest, the fog shifted in perfect sync, as if the air obeyed the figure rather than surrounding it. Margaret stepped back from the screen, heart hammering. If the figure could mimic breath, then it wasn't merely appearing in the frames. It was trying to be recognized. Margaret spread the crime reports across the desk, aligning them in chronological order. 3 murders separated by decades, 3 victims with no connection, yet all marked by the same carved symbol found near Elias' studio. The shape slanted slightly, as though drawn by an unsteady hand that remained unchanged by time. Each report described the same unnatural detail. Bodies discovered with eyes fixed on a point behind the investigator, as if witnessing someone approaching long after death. Margaret felt a tremor run through her. History shouldn't echo itself with such precision. Yet every case mirrored the last, repeating the same frozen gaze, the same carved sigil, the same impossible angles of injury. It was as though the killer moved outside the boundaries of era or identity, leaving behind clues only a camera could follow. As Margaret examined the autopsy records, her breath faltered. Each victim bore marks that defied explanation. Smooth, curved impressions, as though pressed into the skin by a force without shape. Tools of the era couldn't make such patterns. Even modern equipment struggled to replicate the smooth arcs without leaving imperfections. The coroner descriptions repeated the same phrase, no sign of struggle. But these wounds weren't gentle. They were deliberate, precise, almost calculated. Margaret imagined invisible machinery moving through darkness, completing a task with mechanical patience. Or something living that behaved like a mechanism, striking with perfect regularity. The deeper she studied the marks, the more she realized they resembled the warped motion she saw in the footage. Whatever left them wasn't bound by human form. Back in the archive, Margaret examined the film grain under magnification. At first, the texture looked ordinary, tiny grains forming the familiar shimmer of early stock. But as she increased the magnification, she noticed a subtle pattern emerging. The distribution wasn't random. Instead, the grains formed faint lines that, when mapped out, resembled a diagram. She overlaid the frames, aligning the lines until a shape appeared, A map, crude yet unmistakable, marking a path through the alley shown in the reel. The pattern seemed to indicate movement, charting a route the figure took between frames. But the path curved through solid walls and impossible angles, as though the figure navigated space differently from any living being. Margaret felt her blood run cold. The reel wasn't mere footage, it was a record of a journey. Studying the film further, Margaret discovered a single frame that felt wrong the moment it appeared. Unlike the others, it bore no alley, no shadows. Just a close-up of Elias's handwriting scrawled across the emulsion itself. The letters were fragmented, jittering as though recorded mid-motion. The message read like a confession. It followed me. The ink seemed to pulse under the projector's light, as if reacting to the movement of the reel. Margaret felt her throat tighten. This wasn't written on paper. Elias had carved his words directly into the film, scratching through the emulsion with frantic strokes. His desperation seeped through every jagged line. If he believed the figure pursued him beyond the frame, then he wasn't just documenting a phenomenon. He was trying to survive it. When Margaret slowed the film to its final stretch, she noticed an eerie silence creeping into the room. The projector hummed normally, yet the air felt hollow, as though sound itself had stepped aside. The last few frames showed nothing but darkness, but when she increased the exposure, faint symbols appeared, marks etched into the shadows rather than the film. They aligned into a subtle phrase, one Elias must have hidden intentionally. "It speaks when the world is quiet." Margaret stared at the words, realizing the message was not meant for viewers of the past, but for anyone who would restore the footage in the future. The silence around her deepened like a held breath. If the figure communicated through stillness, then the darkness in the frame wasn't empty. It was listening. Margaret began the delicate task of reassembling the fragmented reel, aligning torn pieces with trembling care. Each strip felt heavier than its weight, as though the film itself resisted being restored. As she joined the fragments, images flickered unbidden across the projector wall. Brief flashes of the alley, the figure, Elias's trembling hands. The reel seemed to breathe with every rotation, its motion accompanied by a faint hum that vibrated through the table. Margaret paused, sensing something watching from the edges of the room. When she inspected the repaired strip under the lamp, she saw details she had never noticed before. Faint impressions beneath the emulsion, like fingerprints pressed from the inside. She fought the urge to step back. If something had touched the film from within, then restoration wasn't reviving old footage, it was reopening a door. Frame by frame, Margaret reconstructed the sequence, each new clip bringing clarity, but also dread. She watched Elias adjusting his camera, unaware of the figure standing inches behind him. The image appeared impossibly sharp, captured from an angle no eye could see. Margaret slowed the frame further, noticing the fog ripple around the figure's form. It wasn't dispersing naturally. Its movement suggested breath, but not human breath. As she layered the audio track, she heard faint scrapping sounds beneath the familiar hum of early machinery. The noise repeated at precise intervals, growing clearer with each restored frame. Margaret recognized the rhythm, the same unnatural cadence she observed in the figure's breathing earlier. Whatever moved in those frames hadn't merely been present. It had approached. Margaret arrived at the moment every expert had struggled to explain. The impossible frame, one said to break every principle of optics, now glowed before her. It showed the alley from two angles at once, as though the camera had occupied separate positions in the same instant. Brick patterns overlapped. Fog twisted into mirrored spirals, and the figure stood centered between both perspectives, perfectly sharp in each. Margaret felt dizziness wash over her, as if gravity itself tilted within the frame. She slowed the playback, expecting distortion, but the impossible clarity held. The scene felt like a window opening in two directions at once, revealing a world not bound by linear time. Margaret whispered to herself, realizing what the frame suggested. The camera had not merely observed reality, It had been pulled into another arrangement of it. As Margaret pushed forward, the next restored sequence revealed a figure moving through the alley, not with steps, but with silent shifts that bypassed physical space. Elias appeared in the frame, turning as though sensing something near, yet his eyes never landed on the figure at his side. Margaret leaned closer, noticing that the figure's form flickered between shapes, sometimes elongated, sometimes hunched, sometimes eerily human. With each flicker, the fog bent toward it. The final restored frame showed the figure standing directly behind Elias, its head tilted, its outline vibrating with anticipation. Margaret felt a chill along her spine. She sensed that if she advanced the reel even one more frame, she might witness something no person was meant to see. Something that did not belong to human memory or film. The final fully restored frame stunned Margaret into stillness. It showed not the alley, but a featureless black space, where light seemed to curl inward. In the center stood the figure, clearer than ever, its head angled slightly as though acknowledging her. For the first time, Margaret saw its eyes, two faint glimmers that reflected no light from the projector. They appeared to study her with calm recognition, as though aware of being watched after all these years. Then Margaret noticed something else. Faint outlines behind the figure, silhouettes resembling versions of the alley, the studio, and even the archive itself. Layers of places folded together, as though the reel connected every location touched by the investigation. Margaret stepped back, heart pounding. The figure wasn't trapped in the footage. It was waiting inside the space between frames. Margaret summoned one last expert to review the restored reel, a specialist whose entire career centered on anomalies in early optical devices. The moment he entered the archive, he seemed to sense the weight of the room, pausing before the projector as though approaching a living thing. When the footage began, he leaned forward, eyes narrowing as the impossible frame shimmered on the screen. His breath grew shallow, his shoulders tightening with each passing second. By the time the figure appeared in the void-like final image, he stepped back abruptly, nearly tripping over a chair. He whispered the same words spoken by every expert before him. "That's not possible." But unlike the others, he added something Margaret hadn't expected. "It's waiting for recognition." His voice trembled. "It knows when it's being understood." After the expert left, Margaret sat alone with the reel, playing the final sequence again. This time she focused not on the figure, but on the surrounding darkness. Within the void, faint movements pulsed, tiny distortions curling like smoke trapped behind glass. The more she watched, the more the patterns resembled breathing, not from the figure, but from the spaces between the silhouettes. She realized these echoes mirrored the mismatched rhythms she'd seen earlier. Something else occupied the frame, something unseen, yet undeniably present. Margaret sensed that the reel recorded more than one entity, layered together like overlapping exposures of fear. If the figure was the one watching, then what was the second presence waiting to emerge? She hesitated, afraid of the answer. Margaret rewound the reel to the first appearance of Elias, studying the terror captured in his final frame. His eyes weren't looking at the camera. They were focused slightly above it, as though watching something descend toward him. She slowed the frame further and saw a faint outline above Elias's head, a distortion she had missed before. The shape resembled the same unnatural curve found in the autopsy marks. Her pulse quickened as the truth settled in. The killer captured in the footage was not the figure itself, but whatever controlled the movement around it. The figure was merely the lure, the visible face placed before the lens. The true culprit existed behind the frame, manipulating angles, bending light, and guiding the camera with unseen intent. Margaret felt a shiver move through her. Elias hadn't been documenting a killer. He had been documenting something far older. Margaret considered the consequences of releasing the restored reel. The world would see evidence defying science, history, and even the nature of perception. But as she prepared to store the footage, she noticed something that froze her breath. The figure, once confined to the screen, now appeared slightly closer than before. Its posture leaned forward, as if pressing against an invisible barrier. Margaret replayed older clips, comparing positions. The difference was undeniable. The figure had shifted within the frame across separate viewings. The realization struck her with a chilling clarity. Restoring the reel had awakened something dormant. The footage didn't simply depict a threat. It responded to attention. The more people watched it, the more the figure approached. Margaret understood then that the footage wasn't meant to be studied. It was meant to be contained. With trembling hands, Margaret shut down the projector. The room fell silent, yet she sensed movement in the darkness, an echo of the breathing rhythm she had heard in the restored audio. She packed the reel into its case, sealing it with layers of cloth, hoping it would muffle whatever stirred within the frames. Before leaving, she turned back once more, expecting the archive to return to its familiar stillness. But the last thing she saw was the projector lens glowing faintly, though no power fed it. A thin shimmer rippled across the glass, like an eye opening. Margaret stepped back, unsure whether it was her imagination or the film watching her leave. As she switched off the lights, a single question lingered in the air, heavy and unanswered. If the footage could watch, what would it do once it learned to follow?